just let you jump in and share whatever you want.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming to the north, guys. It's nice to meet you. I'll share a few things on this side, and then we'll go over to the Syrian side. So, what you're looking at now is Lebanon. The top of the ridge line is Lebanon. It meets Hardov, and then the top of Hermon is where it meets Syria. So you're in the triangle border of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. And then about 60 plus kilometers south is the triangle border of Jordan, Syria, and Israel. Let's start with this because there's so many layers to the significance of the Golan. I think that's what I'll touch on, is just the different layers of the significance of it, because for a long time, and even now, I mean, I hear it all the time from Israelis who are like, it has no biblical significance, it's only security. It's a massive security significance for sure, which we'll talk about once we get to the other side. But the biblical significance of it is massive. There's so much here. You know, at the beginning of Deuteronomy, Moses comes into Bashan, which is where you're standing now. You know, Paul on the road to Damascus, this is the road to Damascus, you're pretty much standing on it. Somewhere between, you know, the Hula Valley and Damascus, which is about a 25-minute drive. There is no borders from here. On a clear day, you can see the outskirts of it. So it's very, very close. Like where my wife's family's from, it takes longer than that to drive from the house to the grocery store. You know, you can be in Damascus in about half an hour if it wasn't for all of the obstacles in the way. Same thing with Beirut. It's very close. So we're talking incredible tightness on a geopolitical military level. But for me, one of the coolest things that kind of anchors the significance of the Golan is actually in the Gospels. It's not in, there's a lot of Old Testament stuff about the Golan, but for me there's a lot of kind of hidden significance that you may not pick up on just at a casual reading of the Gospels, but there's so much in it. So if you look at the progression in Matthew 15, 16, 17, 18, Jesus starts in Capernaum, which we'll talk about Capernaum in a minute. Did you guys went to Capernaum?
Yeah.
Okay. We'll back up and talk about that in a minute, but it says Matthew 15, he's in Capernaum, and then it says he goes to Tyre and Sidon, which is in Lebanon today, which is just over, basically there, in Hezbollah land, in Lebanon. So he goes from the Galilee down there, he goes to the coast of Lebanon. You guys remember the story with the woman, and then he essentially implies she's a dog at the table. You remember that? And she acknowledges it and says, yes, I'll take the crumbs. And then he says, that's beautiful faith. I'm paraphrasing, but you remember the story? Well, that happened over there, which is wildly significant because of the Gentile piece. He's in Jewish area, you could say, leaves, goes to Tyre and Sidon, and then from there it says that he goes in Matthew 6, so that's Matthew 15, Matthew 16, it says he goes to the base of Mount Hermon. Did you guys go to Banyas? Did you guys do that?
We just came from Caesarea Philippi. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So Jesus goes there. I'm sure you heard that whole piece there. It's incredibly significant because when Jesus wanted to define the nature of the church for the first time in a definitive way, he comes to the base of the Golan Heights to do it, at the base of Mount Hermon to do it, to make this incredible statement that the gates of hell will not prevail, and this is the foundation of the church that he's building. He chooses to do it there. And then it says in Matthew 17, then he went up to a high mountain. Now there's lots of theories of where the Mount of Transfiguration happened. If you look at the progression of Jesus' movement, I think it's kind of silly to think that he went there, then went there, and then said, let's go way down south and go to a high mountain. It doesn't make any sense. I think that the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah encounter, I think it happened on the Hermon. I think Jesus makes this definitive statement about the nature of the church and then goes up on the Hermon, and that's where Peter, freaks out and says, let's build tabernacles and stay here. And it's, you have the two prophetic custodians of God's purposes standing in front of Jesus glowing, and Peter, the one who just had this interaction with the Lord in Matthew 16, that this all happened right here. And so when you go back to the Old Testament story, it gives a framework for it of why I think it's really incredible. We know the story, Jesus grew up in Nazareth, right? So why did Jesus leave Nazareth? he said a pretty offensive statement. You remember the statement that gets him almost killed and kicked out of Nazareth? He quotes the story of Elisha. Remember the story? He's telling them about this prophetic incident that happened, and the prophet says to the Syrian, if you want to be healed, you need to go dip in the Jordan, which the headwaters of it are in the Golan. And so he's telling the story about this Jewish prophet speaking to a governmental leader in Syria, and says if you want to be healed, you need to come into the covenantal territory and be immersed in the waters on this side of the Hermon. And do you remember the king's response? He says, well, why do I need to do that? I could just dip in the rivers of Damascus. Because on the other side of the Hermon, which we'll talk about in a little bit, because most of our history in the Golan is actually on the Syrian side. So the reason we came here at the beginning was to work on the Syrian side. And so we'll talk about that when we get over there. All these villages along here were home base for us for a number of years, where the priority of our work and ministry was on the Syrian side. And the rivers of Damascus are near a place called Beit Jan, which is on the other side. So if you're looking at the Hermon, it's kind of to the right. I'll show you when we get over there. That's the rivers of Damascus, and still today, they still call it the rivers of Damascus that flow down to the Damascus, like the Jordan River flows here. And the prophet said, no, the rivers of Damascus is not enough. You need to go into this territory and be immersed in the land, the water from the headlands of the Hermon from the Golan. Now, why is that significant? Because Jesus is using the story about the Syrian to say that though the purposes of God are Israel-centric, it involves and it has massive, timely and eternal implications for the Gentiles as well. It's not just it's Israel-centric, it's covenantal for sure, but it's not limited to Israel. And so the statement that Jesus makes when he's talking about this story, he ends up provoking the religious leadership to the point where they want to kill him. And it said, remember, he puts it's like the Lord of the Rings thing, puts the ring on, goes, sneaks out kind of a thing, and no one sees him. It's an interesting story. So now ask yourself this: if you were Jesus and you told a story that provoked and offended the leadership in the place that you spent your entire life, you're now an adult, you spent your entire life there, and this is first century small town redneck village. This is not a big city. Like Nazareth is not what it is today. It was a tiny, meaning everybody knows you. It's I think we lose the flavor of real small hometown village life in the Gospels. Now, he's an adult. He's in his 30 years old-ish. He says this statement, and he needs to now flee because he's not intended to die in Nazareth. He's intended to die in Jerusalem. So ask yourself this question: if you could pick anywhere in the world to base your ministry out of after leaving your hometown where you grew up for 30 years, where would you choose to go? You could go anywhere. You could go anywhere. Now there's lots of reasons for you could go here, you could go there, and for whatever reason, he picked Capernaum. Now the kind of the practical dynamics of it and the way it's normally explained is the Roman road came through there. It's near Magdala. It's practically he could interact with everybody. I think that's true, but I think given the fact that what got him kicked out of Nazareth was telling the story about the Syrians, which is implying that this Israel-centric covenantal plan involves something for the Gentiles, and if you don't get that piece. Now bear in mind, he had just gone there and said the same thing to a Gentile. So to the Gentiles, he's saying you need to honor the covenantal reality of Israel's election and identity and destiny. If you can do that, then you can have crumbs from the table. And she goes, I'll take it. In other words, saying, I acknowledge the election of Israel. And then Jesus goes, there it is! That's what I was after. That's what it is. So the Gentiles have to acknowledge the Israel-centric dynamic of the unfolding of God's purposes. But when he's in Nazareth, he's emphasizing the implications for the Gentiles. Now, the human hearts of both Jewish human hearts and Gentile human hearts, we have the capacity to submit to his purposes and to get offended by his purposes. And they're not the same, but they're fundamentally the same because we're all made of the same dust. So, meaning Jew and Gentile alike are going to get offended over different things on the surface, but at the bottom, we're all sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. It's the same fundamental offense in the human heart over the issue of election. Now, the Gentiles get offended over the issue of election, and it manifests itself in one way. Now, to the Jewish psyche and emotional headspace, it's a different nature of offense, but it's offense nonetheless, because that's the whole point of election, because it raises the issue of do you deserve it or not. I think that's at the very heart of the whole issue of election altogether, is the issue of deserving it or not deserving it. So Jesus is poking everybody over the issue of do you deserve it, do you earn it, whatever. So he says, I'm going to go and choose to set up camp in Capernaum, which sounds cool in English when you say it with a southern drawl, Capernaum. Well, that's not how they said it. It's the village of Nahum. It's Kafar Nahum. It's the village that Nahum grew up in. So it's kind of like in your hometown, like did you have anybody like kind of famous? You're telling the story, like, where are you from? And you say, I'm from wherever, and you're like, it's where Johnny Cash was born, or it's where, it's where some football player grew up. Your town is kind of marked by the identity of this notable person. Well, Jesus chooses the notable person of Nahum, the prophet of Nahum, to say, that's where I want my ministry to be identified. Now, who's Nahum? He's one of the only prophets whose entire ministry was focused on the Gentiles. So we used to live in Iraq before this, in Kurdish Iraq, and we lived right near Nahum's tomb. Now, whether it's actually his tomb or not, the point is there's a heritage that Nahum left here and went there to modern-day Iraq, which was in the Nineveh Plains. And so his ministry was to the Gentiles, and Jesus chooses to hitch his wagon, so to speak, to the prophetic heritage and lineage of this guy Nahum, and to say, I want my ministry to be understood psychologically for the people of the day who knew that's the village of the prophet who went to Nineveh. So he gets kicked out of Nazareth for telling a story about the prophet that ministered to the Syrians, and he chooses the village of the prophet that ministered to the Iraqis, using modern day national terminology. Now, I think that's incredibly significant, because what Jesus is doing is defining the nature of the gospel that he's proclaiming and demonstrating, that it is Israel-centric, but it involves a very robust plan for the Gentiles that requires humility on both sides. It's going to require humility for the Gentiles to bow and submit to it, and it's going to require humility from the covenant people as well to honor and submit to the broader purposes beyond just the land and the people of Israel. Because the purpose of the people of the land in Israel is for the nations. That's the whole point of the initial statement of the covenant in Genesis 12. So as Jesus establishes his ministry there, I think what he's doing is he's anchoring the nature of the gospel representation in this Jew-Gentile mystery. So when he's there, what's the first thing he does? He goes and prays and says, Father, show me who you want me to run with. And who does he go after? He goes after a couple guys, and one of them emerges as this very significant player in the whole thing. His name's Peter, this very interesting fisherman, right? Well, Peter's story is deeply embedded in this internal conflict of the Jew-Gentile peace. Remember, after the resurrection, after Pentecost, the message is Gentiles, go to the Gentiles, go to the Gentiles. And Peter's getting dreams and trances and visions, and he's still in Jerusalem. And then in Acts 10, he gets the vision, and he says, kill and eat, Peter. Come on, Gentiles, go to the Gentiles. And then, you remember what happens? Peter gets sent to where?
Jerusalem, to meet with the council to find out if what he's hearing from God is okay with the other founding apostles.
Before that, right after the vision and the trance in Acts 10, where does the Lord send him to? To the port
of Jaffa. Simon the tanner's house.
So, what's the prophetic heritage of that place? It's the only other prophet that went to the Gentiles and to Nineveh. So I think what Jesus was doing in setting up this whole thing was picking Peter's hometown that was anchored in this story of Nahum. He gets kicked out for telling the story about the Syrians. He chooses a new village on the basis of its connection with modern-day Iraq, the territory of that area. And then Peter is not quite getting the picture, and the way that Jesus helps him get the picture is by saying, go to the place where Jonah had his thing happen to him. So Peter, I think, would have a profound understanding, having been there and had the interaction with the Canaanite woman, having been here and meets with Moses and Elijah, and then he's interacting with this consciousness of the centrality of Israel and the purpose of the nations. And so to me, that's the the prophetic biblical heritage of the Golan is actually that. That there is Israel centricity here, that the foundation of the church is Jesus. But in that, because people will say all the time, it's all about Jesus. It is, but if it's all about him, it's about what he cares about. So it's not like it stops there, It's like, you want to make your wife happy? Everything's about my wife, I'm going to make her happy. Well, what if you don't care what she cares about? It's not really all about her, You're just saying it. So I think a lot of our "it's all about Jesus" rhetoric is pretty shallow because we don't actually take into consideration what he cares about. So what he cares about, I think he demonstrates here by going there, then by going there, and then Paul. Where does Paul have his encounter with Jesus? Here. Right here, on the land that you're standing, the Roman road, whether it was over there, closer to the Nimrod's fortress, I don't know if you guys went there, that was a trade route in the past, or whether it was a more southern trade route. Either way, to get to Damascus, you got to go through the Golan Heights. So Jesus chooses to mark Peter's understanding of his calling in the Golan. And then he chooses to mark Paul for the rest of his life, and you got a good majority of the New Testament because he met Jesus here in the Golan. So whenever I hear people say it doesn't have a lot of biblical significance, I'm like, oh my gosh. This is like deeply embedded in the consciousness of the New Testament, is the significance of the Golan. So you're not just standing in a militarized buffer zone that keeps the state of Israel safe. It is that, but it's so much more than that. And so for me, it's a huge honor to be able to live here. My kids actually go to school right here. This is Kibbutz Marom Golan. My two of my youngest kids go to school here, and then we live. There's that hill there. See the hill? There's the green field, and there's that little bump. Just to the right of that is where my family lives, and this is home for us. And I think about it almost every day, that this place represents something significant in the life of Paul, for the rest of his life. Paul would have had, when you tell your testimony when you first met the Lord, where, when, and how, Paul, it would have been in the Golan. For Peter, it was like in the Golan. Something significant happened in the Golan. For Jesus, it mattered. Psalm 42, my soul pants for you, it thirsts for you. Well, you keep on reading, and he says, I remember the sound of your waterfalls rushes over me, and he says, I remember from the desert up to the Golan. So David was writing the Psalms in the Golan. I just think it's amazing to picture David at there's tons of waterfalls here in the spring and in the winter. I don't know which one it was, but he's up here remembering the flow of the water here. And I think for David, for Moses' first military clash with people of the land is in Deuteronomy 4, here in the Golan. So and then you go back to the beginning and you have the whole crazy story of the Watchers and the Nephilim and Mount Hermon. It happened here. So I just think it's crazy that all these first mentions of things, or first encounters, or first really formative things, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, it happened here. It doesn't mean that other places aren't as significant, but I think for me, digging into it, I start to taste different flavors of the story of God's story that you don't necessarily taste. You taste certain flavors in Jerusalem, You taste certain flavors in the desert. But I think in the Golan, there's flavors that are really unique here that you can taste, and it's incredible. So let's talk security for a second, or like what the next few years are going to hold, just so when you leave here, you kind of feel it and carry it with you. The next few years are going to be really consequential here because this is the most dangerous front for Israel.